Welcome to today's webinar, Farms Under Threat 2040, Choosing an Abundant Future, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning on behalf of the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the US EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The Clearinghouse provides information to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming programs. The views expressed by the speakers in this webinar are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association, as well as 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Farms Under Threat 2040, Choosing an Abundant Future. You can also search for event number 925-7187. So today our speakers are Cris Coffin and Julia Freedgood. Cris Coffin helps to guide the American Farmland Trust's federal and state policy engagement and directs the National Agricultural Land Network, which supports state and local governments, land trusts, agricultural service providers, planners, and conservation organizations to build their capacity to advance farmland protection. From 2015 to 2018, Cris served as a policy director for Land for Good in New England. Before that, she served for 14 years as AFT's New England director. She has held several positions in the U.S. Senate, including as professional staff on the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, and as Chief of Staff to Senator Herb Kohl. Cris co-chairs the Massachusetts Food System Collaborative and serves on our town's Agricultural Commission. She farms part-time with her husband, running a small pastured poultry operation in Western Massachusetts. She's an alumnus of the University of Massachusetts Amherst and holds a Juris Doctor from Georgetown University. Julia Freedgood is a national expert in farmland protection, land tenure and access, agricultural viability, and food system planning. As Senior Fellow and Senior Program Advisor at the American Farmland Trust, Julia focuses on planning and policy framework required to support the livelihoods of farmers and ranchers and to advance equitable and just regional food systems to increase food security and combat climate change. Julia is the author or co-author of many articles and reports. Recent ones include Cultivating the Next Generation, Resources and Policies to Help Beginning Farmers Succeed in Agriculture, Fail to Include, Plan to Exclude, Reflections on Local Government's Readiness for Building Equitable Community Food Systems, and Growing Local, a Community Guide to Planning for Agricultural and Food Systems. She's also the founding member of the North American Food Systems Network and serves on the advisory board and editorial committee of the Journal of Agricultural Food Systems and Community Development. She holds a Master of Arts in Urban and Environmental Planning and Policy from Tufts University. Following their presentation, our presenters will answer as many questions as time permits, and as always, you can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool located on the control panel on the right side of your screen. And as usual, we're going to start with a few polls, actually 3 today. The first one is our usual beginning one, which is just asking everybody where they live and work. And you have 5 options there you can see on the screen. If you're having any trouble responding, you may need to exit from full screen mode, and we'll give everyone about another 45 seconds or so to respond, and we'll share the results with everyone, including our panelists. And thanks to everybody who is here today. As always, we're excited that you have decided to join us. Give you a few more seconds to respond. Thanks to everybody for doing so. Okay, so the poll says that 41% are in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, 21% in the South, 18% West, 16% in the Midwest, and 4% are outside of the US today. Okay, we have another poll for you. What type of entity do you work for? And you can choose one of the 5 categories: public agency, consultant, nonprofit, academic, or other. And again, you may need to exit from full screen mode. And again, thank you for participating in this. It's good information for our presenters as they begin to talk about the topic today. We'll close this up momentarily. Okay, in this case, 60% of our audience is public agency, public sector folks, 19% consultants, 10% nonprofit, 3% academic, and 9% none of the above or other. Okay, well, another quick one for you before we launch the topic. That is, from your perspective, what is the primary cause of farmland conservation in your region? And please select one of these: lack of farm profitability, poorly planned development, aging farmers, escalating land values, other. And again, we'll give everybody a few seconds to respond. And then we will start. This is always good information for us in terms of what's happening within your communities. And a couple more seconds for you all. Okay, so here escalating land values were cited by 44%, poorly planned development at 20%, aging farmers 16%, lack of farm profitability is 13%, and 6% said other. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Cris Coffin to get us started. Welcome, Cris.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction, Michael. We are delighted for this opportunity to present on our latest Farms Under Threat report, choosing an abundant future, and we're excited to talk about planning for agriculture. Thank you very much for those polls. It's very interesting, both the mix of people that we have around the virtual room geographically and by type of entity that you all work for, and we are very interested, and toward the end we'll talk a little bit more about those causes of farmland conversion. But as Michael noted, I direct our National Agricultural Land Network, which is a free information and peer learning network for professionals working to save farmland, and I'm guessing that includes many of you on this webinar today, and that's whether through permanent farmland protection, planning and zoning, or through many of the other tools in the toolbox. If you are not yet a member of the network, I suspect that some, if not many of you, might be a good fit. So if you are not yet a member, please feel free to join, and there is a link to the network in the chat. So Julia and I will be tag teaming on this presentation. I'm going to start with a quick review of our 2020 Farms Under Threat State of the States report, and then turn to our latest Farms Under Threat findings. We'll take a quick live cruise through our latest web app and the spatial data layers available. And then Julia will share her thoughts about the need to plan for agriculture in the context of smart growth, the kinds of strategies AFT has found to be effective, and weave in some examples of places where we've worked that have successfully engaged with planning for agriculture. Let me first introduce American Farmland Trust for those of you who may not be familiar with us. We are a national nonprofit membership organization founded in 1980. Some know us best, or perhaps only, by our bumper sticker, "No Farms, No Food." We work at the intersection of agriculture and conservation. Our national initiatives and our regional programs focus not just on protecting the agricultural land base, but also on the farming practices used on that land and on the farmers and ranchers themselves who work the land now and in the future. Our research focuses on both the risks to and the benefits from well-managed agricultural land and informs our state and federal policy advocacy. We have 6 regional offices and a national office headquartered in Washington, D.C. Our Farms Under Threat research is the latest in a series of AFT research initiatives that have documented agricultural land loss across the U.S., and we've done this for decades. In this Farms Under Threat multi-year initiative, we set out to create the most detailed map ever created of the extent, diversity, location, and quality of agricultural land in the U.S., as well as the threats to this land from expanding commercial, industrial, energy, and residential development. An important note about the mapping, and particularly for those of you who are in Hawaii or Alaska or outside of the U.S., our spatial data is available only for the 48 continental United States. Unfortunately, there is insufficient national data available in the data sets that we use for Alaska and Hawaii. We wish it were otherwise. We'd like to recognize and thank USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service for their partnership and financial support of our Farms Under Threat research. NRCS has been invaluable to this research project, as has our research partner, Conservation Science Partners. And for Farms Under Threat 2040, we also collaborated with the University of Wisconsin at Madison. So Farms Under Threat 2040 builds from our earlier work on Farms Under Threat State of the States, which was published in 2020. And Julia was a lead author of that report. That State of the States report mapped the full extent of the agricultural land base for the 48 continental states and then evaluated the productivity, versatility, and resiliency of that agricultural land. That analysis resulted in a comprehensive national map showing the suitability of agricultural land for producing food and other crops. State of the States also documented the extent of agricultural land conversion between 2001 and 2016. And it included a first-of-its-kind state policy scorecard, which measured how each state has responded through policy to the threat of agricultural land loss. State of the States found that 11 million acres of agricultural land across the U.S. were converted to or compromised by development in just the first 15 years of this century alone. 11 million acres is equivalent to all the U.S. farmland devoted to fruit, nut, and vegetable production in 2017, or equivalent to the loss of 2,000 acres of agricultural land a day. It's important to remember that this steep level of conversion occurred despite a time period in which there was a severe recession and plummeting housing starts. State of the States was also the first nationwide attempt to distinguish between types of conversion, specifically whether land was converted to urban and highly developed land uses, or what we like to call UHD, or to low density residential land use, which we have pegged LDR. To identify urban and highly developed land for all of these reports, we relied on the comprehensive National Land Cover Database, which identifies areas where the land cover is highly impervious. We recognize, though, that the National Land Cover Database misses an expanding threat to production agriculture, namely large lot residential developments that increasingly fragment the landscape, threatening the viability of working farms and ranches. To address this challenge, we partnered with Conservation Science Partners to develop a new low-density residential land use class in which the average housing density is above the level where agriculture is typically viable. It's also useful to note here that some agriculture can be found on this low density residential land. Smaller farm parcels, especially those near urban centers, can be both productive and profitable. However, what we found was that once land has been converted to low density residential land use, it is far more likely to be further converted to urban and highly developed land and thus out of the agricultural land base entirely. Between 2001 and 2016, agricultural land in low density residential areas was 23 times more likely to become urbanized than other agricultural land. I mentioned that State of the States evaluated the quality of agricultural land across the U.S. based on its productivity, versatility, and resiliency, or what we call its PVR values. This map shows each state's agricultural land by its PVR value. The darker the green, or the darker the tan in the case of rangeland, the higher its PVR value. The map also shows where conversion occurred in each state between 2001 and 2016. And when you look at the map, not surprisingly, higher quality agricultural land, which is typically flat and well drained, is often the most desirable for development. So that was some of the methodology and findings from our State of the States report, which mapped actual conversion. Now, talking about Farms Under Threat 2040, Choosing an Abundant Future, this report takes a different approach. It looks forward using past conversion data to model and predict future conversion of farm and rangeland out to 2040. So using the land conversion data we had from 2001 to 2016, we projected into the future with a business as usual scenario. Basically, we made a straight line projection using the same annual conversion rate as that during the 15-year time period of 2001 to 2016 to predict the level and location of conversion by 2040. We adjusted the model to account for projected population growth. Building off that business as usual scenario, we developed two alternative scenarios, and we'll get to those in a minute. In each of the three scenarios, we also mapped the coastal flooding risk that is projected by sea level rise. Once we had our projections of conversion and flooding risk, we quantified the effects of these scenarios, looking at both the type of agricultural land likely to be converted, so is it cropland, pastureland, rangeland, as well as on the quality of that land based on its PVR values. As with any modeling exercise, there are some important caveats. Most importantly, we were not able to account for the myriad of local land use regulations across the country. This means that our maps represent the general pattern and rough amount of conversion that is likely based on conversion patterns from 2001 to 2016. Our maps do not reflect what may be allowed or prohibited on the ground through local land use regulations. Our modeling also does not account for the potential impact of water scarcity and fallowing of land because of lack of water. Mapping this impact involves complex variables and was simply beyond the scope of our analysis. You'll see when we get to the web app, though, that we did include a data overlay from World Resources Institute's Aqueduct, which offers some projections about water availability into the future. So here are the three scenarios we modeled. First, business as usual, again, taking that 2001 to 2016 data and making a straight line projection out to 2040. The second scenario is what we call runaway sprawl. This envisions a scenario where low density residential land use accelerates. We see this trajectory is entirely possible, given both that the period we modeled was a recessionary one, and given high housing costs and shortages in large and small cities alike, and the likely permanent shift to more remote work opportunities. And remote work may become even more appealing as rural broadband expands and improves. Lastly, we modeled the future we hope for, better built cities. This scenario envisions successful efforts to reduce the footprint of residential, commercial, and industrial development on productive agricultural land. While the scenario still results in the conversion of some agricultural land, it envisions a future with a smaller development footprint and vibrant, compact cities, towns, and rural communities. So a quick look at the assumptions that went into these three scenarios. For business as usual, we followed the historical rate for urban and highly developed and low density residential conversion. Because urban development is closely tied to population growth, we adjusted the urban and highly developed land conversion rate to account for population increases. We did not adjust the low density residential conversion rate, as there is no similar corollary to population change. For runaway sprawl, urban and highly developed land conversion remains the same, but we projected a 50% increase in the rate of low density residential conversion. And for better built cities, we modeled a 25% reduction in the UHD conversion rate and a 50% reduction in the LDR conversion rate. Research has shown that this increased level of density is possible for urban areas. We went with a more aggressive 50% reduction in low density residential conversion, which we felt represented an ambitious but achievable goal. So let's look at a couple of charts. This chart shows each scenario's potential impact. Here you see on the left the gray areas, which are the 11 million acres converted from 2001 to 2016. Under business as usual, or worse, runaway sprawl, we could see another 18.4 to 24.4 million acres of farm and ranch land converted. And again, you see here the difference. The darker orange is the converted to urban and highly developed land. The lighter orange is the conversion to low density residential land use. And here you see is that if we are able to make smart choices about where and how we site future development, we can reduce that agricultural land loss to 11 million acres. I know some of you are probably thinking 11 million acres is still a lot, and can't we shrink our footprint even more? We hope we can, but AFT also recognizes the acute shortage of affordable housing options around the country, as well as the urgent need to transition to renewable energy production. So we chose what we believe is a realistic scenario. These next two slides show development projections by county across the US. This one you see shows total projected acres converted, and again, because some of the larger tracts involved and the rate of conversion, you see it's most pronounced in the Southwest and some in Texas, and we will look at that a little bit more. This next slide compares the percent of agricultural land in each county that is projected to be developed. And here you see a slightly different pattern with more of the eastern half of the US, again, becoming that darker red because there's a lot of conversion in these smaller counties and a smaller amount of agricultural land to begin with. Looking at it in a different way, here you see this chart that shows the top 12 states in terms of total acres projected to be converted. That's the chart on the left, and the percent of the agricultural land base projected to be converted on the right. And you can see here that in the first 6 states that percentage conversion is over 10%. And if we think about runaway sprawl, that a few are over 20% of their agricultural land base. And looking on the left-hand side, again, you see 3 states with over 1 million acres. Texas, unique in that it's over 2 million acres of potential agricultural land converted. So we've used the productivity, versatility, and resiliency, or PVR index, in 2 different ways. The map I showed earlier showed agricultural land by state according to its relative PVR value. This map shows the location of all agricultural land with PVR values above a specific threshold, which we consider to be nationally significant land. This is land best suited for long-term cultivation and food production. The loss of this nationally significant land is especially concerning. This is land that can produce the highest yields of crops and livestock with the least environmental impact. Our modeling shows that nearly half of the projected conversion from 2016 to 2040 will occur on this nationally significant land, even though it represents about 38% of all the country's agricultural land. The more nationally significant land converted, the more reliant we become on marginal land for food production. And the more marginal land we use, the greater the input costs for producers and the likely impacts on water, air, and wildlife. Here's a chart of the states likely to lose the most acres of nationally significant land. You see that at the top it looks quite a bit like the last chart of total acres, but importantly here, note that 3 new states appear on this, all of them in the Midwest: Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan, the heart of America's farm country. So we examined 2 other threats to the agricultural land base. One was the threat caused by coastal flooding as a result of sea level rise. We mapped what this might look like in 2040 based on a 7.5 inches of additional sea level rise. We found that 450,000 acres of farmland and ranchland could be flooded by 2040. This number does not include salinization of soils and groundwater, which will jeopardize many more acres even before land is inundated. Additionally, we found that nearly 500,000 acres of existing urban and highly developed and low-density residential land will be flooded nationally, resulting in population and development shifts. The result may be another 2.7 million acres of agricultural land nationally that could be converted as a result of coastal flooding of existing development. The last threat we looked at is the threat that solar development poses to agricultural land. To be clear, American Farmland Trust supports renewable energy development, and we think it's possible for agriculture and solar to coexist. However, we think it's essential that we plan carefully so that our most productive, versatile, and resilient land is not compromised. As you can see from this slide, solar development has increased dramatically since 2016, so past conversion rates will obviously not reflect this emerging challenge. So when we were beginning our modeling, we looked to the U.S. Department of Energy's solar future studies. The Farms Under Threat geospatial prediction is based on this study's SFS reference scenario, which you see is this lower one of the lines on the right-hand side. That scenario assumes the need for 3 million acres of land nationally devoted to solar development by 2050. However, since we started the modeling for Farms Under Threat 2040, we now believe the more likely scenario is the more aggressive decarbonization and electrification of U.S. energy production one, that scenario that is at the top, which projects the need for an additional 10 million acres of land in solar production by 2050. So this next map shows the projected acres of land that will be needed by state for utility scale solar development under that DOE decarbonization and electrification scenario. If you're interested in more information about the solar modeling we did, our solar technical paper is available with our other Farms Under Threat 2040 materials. We will also be releasing a solar white paper later this year, and we have a significant number of resources about smart solar siting. The most important takeaway from our modeling here related to solar is that 83% of the projected solar development by 24 will be sited on agricultural land, and nearly half of the projected solar development will be sited on nationally significant land. So we are now going to take a tour of the maps and data available on our interactive website. And for this, we have our behind the scenes tour guide, Beth Fraser, who will be doing the navigating as I do the narrating. So when I say, Beth, how about we do this? Know that Beth is out there and navigating us very capably through this website. So thank you, Beth. And we are now in the website. And when you start, you see this handy overview. You can X right out of it because it's all of the things that we've talked about. If you want to look at it again, you can find it in the About tab up there on the far upper right tab. So let's stick up what else you can see on this far right tab. And the reason we are taking you through the website is that we invite you, once we're done with this webinar, we'll put a link into the website. There is lots of useful information in here, and we hope you will explore it and find it helpful. So up here in the right-hand corner, you'll see a how-to tab. That takes you to a 5-minute video that explains how to use the various data layers in the scenarios. The View Report tab up there takes you to our Farmland Information Center. I think Beth is going to click on it right now, where you can see the full report and the executive summaries for Farms Under Threat 2040, as well as the earlier Farms Under Threat report and the solar white paper and a number of other technical reports if you have more technical questions. So again, the Farmland Information Center is a wonderful resource generally. This is just one of many, many things that you can find on that website, and we encourage you to go to the center when you have an opportunity. We are making our geospatial data layers and other data available to anybody interested. If you would like them, that last tab up there, Request Data, is the place to learn more and to make that request. And I want to say right now that there's a lot of county level information. We'll get into it a little bit, but if you are looking for particular county information that you don't see, please go to this form and ask your question, because chances are that we will be able to give you some very useful data. So now as Beth is going to help us go, we're going to go to Texas. And we, I think, are going to go to Bear, Texas, if I'm right on where we're going to go. And here you see, what you see here, you can see a couple of things, right? On the left-hand side, when you click on whatever state you want to go to, you will see on the left the state level data. And here for Texas, you can see it's about, in the business as usual scenario, it's a pretty even split between our projections on urban and highly developed land conversion and conversion to low density residential land use. And when you scroll, as Beth is doing that over these little graphs, you see these numbers and that the difference between the two types of conversion coming up. We happen to be in Bexar County. You could go anywhere, and wherever your cursor is what county is going to come up on the right-hand side. But let's keep going down here and look a little bit more about what you can tell from this. Here you can see again what percent of the conversion is likely to be on your state or county's best land. And then again, those that what we consider to be best land is the upper half of the PVR values of land in the county or the state. So here you can see that the conversion projections for Texas's top 50% of its agricultural land in terms of productivity, versatility, and resiliency. And you see those numbers by county. So again, it's a pretty significant conversion of some of that best land. Going down a little bit further, you see here that we also show you conversion likely, and these numbers are available at the county level. You need to request them, but they are available in terms of the type of land that is likely to be converted. So here you see rangeland being far and away for the state, the most amount of acres projected for conversion, followed by pasture land, followed by cropland. A note about this woodland number: our Farms Under Threat report was the first time where anyone has tried to classify woodland spatially associated with a farm or a ranch. So this is not all projected woodland. conversion in Texas. It is just that woodland that is associated with a farm or a ranch. And if you want more details about how we derive those figures, they're all in the technical report. But again, that's what that number is. And then just down, as I had said before, that once land is in low density residential land use, that it is way more likely to be further developed. And here you see that 23 times likely figure that I mentioned. I want to show you one more thing before we actually zoom into the maps a little bit more. And here is for every state, we have a downloadable, easily downloadable 2-page fact sheet that Beth is putting her cursor on. So if she clicks on that, Beth, that'd be great. Takes you to this easily downloadable, easily printed, easily shareable 2-pager, which we hope folks will use for education and engagement of policymakers, for members of your organization, for agency officials, lots of good uses for this, for local planning boards. Again, you see all of the data. What's interesting about this data is that one of the things that we have included is what are the likely impacts of the loss of over 2 million acres of agricultural land in Texas. And here, based on the numbers from the 2017 Census of Agriculture, you see that it's the equivalent of losing potentially over 11,000 farms and ranches, almost $500 million in lost farm output, and about 26,200 jobs in the agricultural sector. So again, these are significant numbers, and we hope that it helps to make the case for the need for agricultural land protection. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about how we zoom in to counties here, and for that we are now going to zoom into Bexar County. And to get us started, Beth, can you show the drop-down menu for the 3 modeled scenarios on the left-hand side of the map? So in there, please select Runaway Sprawl as the modeled scenario on the left, and Better Built Cities as the scenario on the right. And before we zoom in here, we want to show a little bit of the functionality of the maps and how you can change views to best serve your needs. Beth, can you show the audience the legend up in the right-hand corner? Okay, so that again shows you what you're seeing on the map and the various types of land uses. As our base map is currently in the 2016 land cover view, you can see the different colors that represent the modeled land use scenarios and the land cover base map. So while we're here, can you demonstrate how to adjust the transparency of the data by using that toggle in the upper right-hand corner? So there you can see, again, you can, with this land use cover map, you can look underneath the proposed conversion to see what exactly the land is underneath. So now, Beth, can you show them the various views that they can select in the platform? You can change your base map by going to the top right corner that Beth just did. This is the satellite view that gives you a bird's eye view of the landscape with the selected scenarios stacked up. And with the slider up in the right-hand corner, you can adjust the transparency of that. And then looking at the standard view, you can see that gives you a sort of more of a contrast. That again, you can see that is giving you a brighter look at where the projected conversion is. And again, as you sort of zoom in, you can see that we are distinguishing between that lighter orange, which is the projected low density residential conversion, and the darker burnt orange, which is the urban and highly developed land. So that gives you a sense of how you can use this tool. We're just going to do a couple more. I think we're going to do 3 different states. So now we're going to change states just to give you a sort of little view of some other places. We're going to go to Georgia. Going east over to Georgia, where we're going to go to Hall County. And since Beth is from Georgia, she's got a good sense of where things are in Georgia. And again, so here you see Hall County. Again, I think, Beth, you were on the left is the Runaway Sprawl, on the right is the better built cities. And you can see again this pattern of conversion, of particularly low density residential conversion that is going way out into the suburbs and way up into the corridor towards whatever that next city is up to the northeast, which I can't see right here. Okay, but you can see really that distinction in how in that middle sort of center left, that amount of low density conversion happening there. So let's go to, now let's go to Ohio. And again, our purpose is just to sort of show you a little bit about how to use and navigate through here and what you can be looking for. So we're going to Wayne County, Ohio. All right. And zooming in again, and I think that maybe Julia will be talking a little bit about Wayne County, but when you look at this again here, you see in Ohio how much different than Texas, and I don't remember looking at what the Georgia numbers were, but looking down at Ohio as a whole and Wayne County in particular, it's significant low density residential conversion that is the primary conversion threat here. And again, you see how it's going along the interstate corridor and again north of the city. So that's an example in Ohio. And then lastly, let's just go quickly to St. Mary's County, Maryland. I suspect we have quite a number of Maryland folks. And then in here, we wanted to show this particularly because here is an example of when you zoom in a little bit, when you look at this blue and looking at the blue, both at St. Mary's County and the amount of low density residential conversion that is likely, which is significant in this county, but looking to the right and the eastern shore, again, that blue is the projected flooding associated with sea level rise and what that might do. And when you look on this map and go into Delaware, that again, that sea level rise is likely to have an impact on that land, both in St. Mary's County and going up on into the eastern shore and into Delaware. So that's the quick cruise through the website. We hope that was helpful. I'm going to turn it over to Julia in a moment, but before I do, I just want to mention that the report has policy recommendations in each of these 4 categories. We hope that they will be useful. They are recommendations at every level of government. So if you are a municipal or county official or employee, state legislator, staff at a state or federal agency, or staff to a member of Congress, we hope you can find a recommendation in here that you would like to champion. Please let us know if there's any more information we can give you about any of the policy items in this report. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julia Freedgood, though I think we're going to have a couple more polls right before she starts.
Great, thanks, Cris. Yes, we're going to 2 more polls here for everybody to respond to. And the first one is a quick yes or no. Do you work on agricultural issues? And again, you may need to exit from full screen mode to respond. We'll give everybody, again, a few seconds to do so. I think this is the kind of good context for the rest of the presentation. And again, thanks for those who are responding. See them coming in. A few more seconds for you to participate today. And a pretty even split, but not quite. So 53% yes, 47% no. And finally, one last poll for you today. Okay, so if you answered yes to the last poll, In what way do you engage with agriculture? And you have, you can select any of these: land use planning, urban agriculture, food systems, conservation, and production agriculture. So that's, you don't have to have just one response for this one. So again, we'll give maybe another 30 seconds or so for people to participate in this one. And thanks for doing so. Okay, so 73% said land use planning, 38% conservation, 19% urban agriculture, 16% food systems, and 12% production agriculture. So we will now turn it over to Julia.
Great, thank you. And thanks, Cris, and hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. That was a very interesting poll, and I hope for those of you who don't work on ag issues, by the time I'm done, you think maybe you'll consider it. I'm going to share some thoughts about how we got to where we are and where we need to go from here. And then I'm going to talk about some approaches we've used that we've found to be effective, especially in rural communities, and weave in some examples of places where we've worked. The report's policy recs and what Cris just presented revolve around smart growth. But since you're all part of the Smart Growth Network, I expect you're well versed in that. And so I'm going to cast a wider net and ask you to consider how you might include agriculture in your planning activities. The photo in this slide is a good example of what I mean. It's of Lexington, Kentucky, in Fayette County, which is home to the nation's first urban service boundary. No, it was not in Oregon, which was established back in 1958. It's a great example of what local governments can do, in this case, as part of a coordinated municipal county action to achieve shared goals. In 2000, Lexington Fayette passed a purchase of development rights program, and since then has permanently protected more than 30,000 agricultural acres. But the city is still growing through compact, fiscally responsible development patterns, while it's also preserving its agriculture and rural character. This approach has saved infrastructure costs, it's enhanced connectivity, it's created vibrant neighborhood businesses, and it's also supported a healthy agricultural sector, which is responsible for 1 out of 12 jobs and $2.3 billion in annual output. Most recently, they've stepped out beyond their land use policies to support local farmers by creating a local food systems stakeholder group and a group called Bluegrass Farm to Table, which facilitates coordination and collaboration, market and value chain development, everything from like farmers markets and farm to school to aggregation, distribution, and processing infrastructure for local producers. This progression, I think, in Lexington Fayette is a really great example of how you can integrate smart growth and planning for agriculture. And so what do I mean by planning for ag? What I mean, I put it up on the slide. It's a way to create a public policy framework to protect farmland, to promote ag conservation practices, and to support local agriculture for community benefits, including economic development, ecosystem services, and community food security. It can occur at state, regional, or local levels. It can result in a standalone plan, or it can be included as part of a comp plan or master plan, or any other kind of plan like a food system sustainability or emergency management plan. Since I've pivoted from the findings of the Farms Under Threat report to addressing ag and rural communities, it seems to make sense to provide a little context. So over the 20th century, technological advances combined with a policy paradigm of get big or get out transformed American agriculture from being diverse and localized to specialized and globalized. Federal farm policy prioritized productivity, and in the process, the sector became a major global player, as well as a cornerstone of state and local economies. In 2020, the food and farming sector contributed more than $1 trillion to GDP. But this came with a host of negative externalities, including farmland conversion, but also environmental degradation and erosion of rural prosperity and the loss of millions of farms and ranches. So in this century, agriculture must be transformed again, and this time for resiliency to meet the evolving needs of the 21st century. And this is going to take more than federal farm policy. It's going to take concerted efforts of many groups like AFT and of course the farmers and ranchers on the ground, but the smart growth community has an important role to play. So it's good to see how many of you came from public agencies. Anyway, this slide is really just to give you some of the numbers to give you an idea of what that transition looked like. So in 1900, there were 6 million farms supporting a population of only 76 million people who mostly lived in rural areas. They were small, diversified, labor intensive, and employed nearly half the US workforce. And thanks to modern technology and especially widespread use of fossil fuels, farm productivity surged, especially during the 60s, sort of between the 1960s and 1980s, which has led to the specialization and increasing farm consolidation we see today. At the same time, rapid suburban expansion encroached on farmland, taking millions of acres out of production, driving up land values and threatening ag viability. So average farm size rose 67%, farm numbers dropped 63%, and today there are 2 million farms and the population has reached about 330 million people, mostly living in urban areas. Our Farms Under Threat research shows how conversion is continuing its insidious creep. But Cris talked a lot about the conversion, right? And so I'm not really going to go into any detail on that. I'm going to focus on two other issues, which I think are really important, both in combination with conversion, but also on their own. And communities need to deal with these if they care about having a future for agriculture. And they're climate change and consolidation. So climate change threatens agriculture in many ways, starting with climate migration and demand for citing renewable energy, which Cris talked about, and including the impacts of extreme weather on agricultural production. And I'm sure we're all aware of how climate change is affecting the communities where we work and live. Right now, Hurricane Ian is pounding Florida and moving up the coast. But it's especially hard on farmers and ranchers who have to deal with the vagaries of weather on a day-to-day basis. Food crops like fruits and vegetables are especially sensitive to climate stressors. So take California, for example, where over 1/3 of our vegetables and 3/4 of our fruits and nuts are grown. After years and years of unrelenting drought, this year California had to idle almost 400,000 acres of cropland and deal with lower yields due to reduced water application. The drought also has led to increases in wildfires with devastating destruction of crops, land, and property. And it's not just California, and it's not just drought, right? In the Midwest, heavy rains and flooding in 2019 took out nearly 20 million acres of cropland because they were too wet to plant. And there are just many, 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 many examples of this from all across the country. So we need to create more resilient farming systems that are diverse and regionalized, that promote regenerative agricultural practices and address the needs of community members. And when I say community members, I include farmers and ranchers, and not just the large profitable ones, but also the millions of small and underserved farmers and farm workers who typically are overlooked in farm policies but have to deal with this every day. One of the few positive outcomes of the first year of COVID was that even as the large consolidated food supply chains broke down, small and mid-sized farmers pivoted quickly to fill important gaps in community food supplies. And they finally got some long-deserved recognition as essential workers. Places with strong local food economies fared well, like where Cris and I live in Western Mass, and can become models of what communities can do to ensure resiliency. When managed using regenerative practices or climate-smart farming practices, ag lands can serve as a natural carbon sink or sequester carbon by drawing down carbon dioxide and storing it in plants and soils. According to the EPA, ag land use and forestry have removed more CO2 from the atmosphere than they've created in emissions. so are considered a net sink rather than a net source of carbon dioxide. Still, they contribute about 11% of the US total of greenhouse gases, largely due to liquid manure from concentrated animal feeding operations or CAFOs. But even as livestock gets a bad rap, cropping systems also play a part. And today, most cropping production uses tillage to break up and turn over soil to plant seeds and control weeds and other things. But tilling kills beneficial microorganisms, which build and sustain soil health. Nitrogen fertilizers also emit nitrous oxide, which contributes to climate change. So it's really, really important to rebuild carbon stocks in agricultural soils for continued productivity and to address climate change. Some farmers already are adopting regenerative practices, planting cover crops, using rotational grazing systems, low till, no till, and so on. But they need to do a lot more, which will require technical assistance and community support. So I've talked a little bit about small and mid-sized farmers, and I think they're really, really important. They are the majority of American agriculture, and they employ more people, they create more cohesive communities, and they contribute more to local economies than large and very large farms. They're more likely to be diversified. They're more likely to purchase equipment and supplies locally and to sell into local food markets, helping to ensure community food security and serving as a hedge against supply chain disruptions. But they struggle to remain viable, which makes them especially vulnerable to ag land conversion and to consolidation. And consolidation, I mentioned it earlier, is something that I think we all really need to think about long and hard. Agricultural wealth increasingly is concentrated on fewer and fewer, larger and larger, more specialized farms. In 2015, only 5% of farms, of the large farms, which are the ones with more than $1 million in sales, accounted for more than half, actually 58% of the value of farm production, compared to under a third in 1991 adjusted for inflation. 2% are non-family farms, which control nearly 12% of farmland and contribute 12% of production, and their share keeps going up. And the top 1% of the very largest, most specialized farms with sales of 5 million or more supply 35% of the value of farm products. Their share keeps growing. So as small and medium farms get squeezed out of agriculture, their land usually gets developed or gets folded into larger and larger operations, driving more consolidation of farm businesses and cropland. So while many economists consider consolidation a good thing because it's believed to lower food prices, because the farmer's share of the cost of food is so small, it really has negligible impact on the price of food. In 2020, the farmer's share of the food dollar was only 8 cents. But these low prices have a devastating effect on farm viability. In 2020, median farm income was minus almost $1,200. Today, 96% of farm households have off-farm income, and this is neither equitable nor sustainable. And this is another reason it's really important to plan for agriculture. These are the kinds of issues we deal with all the time. This circular diagram is something we use to guide our efforts. We created it with partners based on experiences through a collaborative project I was involved in a few years ago called Growing Food Connections. I think there's going to be a link to that in the chat. What I think is really important about our approach is we take an asset-based approach, and we find this especially important in rural communities. We like to do asset mapping to get community members excited about what they have to work with before sort of getting into the things that they lack. Often this is an informal process, but it can be rigorous as well. Our process isn't linear. There are fits and starts and lots of back and forth to make adjustments along the way. But at some point, it addresses, the key planning activities. And since the majority of you are land use planners, I don't need to really go through what all of the things mean. But it starts, or at least at some point should include everything from developing shared vision, values, and goals to doing assessments, to generating choices and ideas from the community, to enacting policies and solutions with metrics to gauge progress, the progress and then adjusting when things don't go as planned. But I think what's really, really important to us is the collaborative element of it, pursuing multi-sector, public and private, and multi-stakeholder engagement all along the way. So we put engagement in the middle of the circle. Instead of it being a step, we consider it something that really needs to be built into everything to illustrate how it happens throughout the process. And that includes engaging a diverse group of farmers and ranchers, depending on where you are. An example of this comes from Wayne County, which Cris mentioned and showed as the Ohio example. Wayne is a rural county kind of wedged in between Cleveland and Columbus. Most of their ag land is nationally significant, but they're under a lot of pressure already, and they're really well aware of the low density development that's happening. So we're involved with a collaborative process through a project called Pathways to Prosperity. And we have a farmer leadership group that includes Farm Bureau, which represents mainstream ag, especially dairy farmers, Local Roots, which works with farmers selling local food mostly through direct-to-consumer channels, the Amish, who grow lots of produce and sell through local auction houses, and Cooperative Extension. And the interesting thing is these groups weren't working together before we got started. So, engaging sort of the diversity of the ag community is really important. We also use the community capitals framework as an alternative planning approach for rural communities anyway. And I see we're kind of running short on time, so I won't go into it a lot. But if you're not familiar with it, it's community capitals or assets, because I'm not an ag economist, so I don't really like using the capitals language. But the assets are any type of resource that can be invested, used, or saved to build community wealth. And they start with things like nationally significant farmland, natural assets, right? Lakes, wetlands, woodlands, and so on. Cultural assets like a farm fair, ethnic festival. Human assets like resident skills and abilities. And related to this, social assets or social capital, which people may be familiar with, that makes, the social fabric that makes things happen, connections and relationships between people and organizations. And then I think, you probably are familiar with some of the other capitals, but all communities have some of these. So even in rural communities, we're built, and you don't have to go back, Beth, we're built-in financial assets tend to be limited. Communities have other valuable assets that can be leveraged to support ag and community residents. So I hope we have time for this, but I thought it might be helpful to share two different kinds of examples of these planning activities. And the first is in Kansas, where local governments in Douglas County and the city of Lawrence, so it's another county municipality effort, work together to address food and farming challenges through planning, shared staff positions, and funding for programs. It's Kansas, so they have a very strong agricultural sector, mostly producing commodity crops, but also some specialty crop production. And if you're not familiar with that term, specialty crops are fruits, vegetables, and nuts. The number of small and mid-sized specialty crop operations is growing to take advantage of strong consumer demand for local food, as well as their very rich soils and easy access to water. But even though they have a lot of opportunities, they have challenges. Their best soils are on land that's already been developed or is under significant development pressure. Land values are extremely high. Direct marketing opportunities are plentiful, but there's little infrastructure for food processing, distribution, vegetable packing, aggregation, and so on. So they adopted an environmental chapter in their joint comp plan, which includes a component to provide direction and framework for county and city food systems initiatives. They created 2 new positions, a full-time sustainability coordinator and a food systems coordinator, and created a common ground ag program that does many things, including leasing vacant city-owned property to farmers and gardeners. In Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, which is really well known for its farmland preservation program, about a quarter of the county's land area is used for farming. primarily dairy, poultry, and specialty crop production. Their 2006 growth management plan was designed to achieve and sustain the county's vision of a balanced community where urban centers prosper, natural landscapes flourish, and farming is strengthened as an integral component of its diverse economy and cultural heritage. Since then, the county adopted an approach to protect large blocks of contiguous land and improve connectivity. It's permanently protected more than 20% of its farmland. It has strong growth management and green infrastructure elements. And its planning commission balances county and municipal policy for ag and natural resource conservation and works to sustain the viability of the ag economy. As a result, farms are prospering with an average net cash farm income over $90,000 in 2017. Nearly half are using regenerative practices, including no-till and cover cropping. So I'm going to start to wrap up, but supporting farms and protecting farmland doesn't happen in a vacuum, and we appreciate that communities need housing, transportation, jobs, clean energy, etc. So we take a systems, not a sector approach. We've also learned over the years that planning is most successful when driven by the people most affected by the policy decisions at hand. So we go out of our way to build in community participation, hold meetings in convenient places at convenient times, and to engage farmers and ranchers. You know, we try to do it in the winter or during the evenings or just go out to the farm. I've already talked about taking an asset-based approach, but even if you take another approach, it's important to recognize and celebrate the community's assets in their various forms and to balance the community's multi-sectoral needs. This is where tools like our Farms Under Threat maps can be so valuable so that you can, see where your best soil resources are and, focus protection on them. And then, looking at your more marginal soils for affordable housing, solar development, and so on. The most important part of the plan is the actions which come out of it. So we plan with implementation in mind. And finally, over the years, we've learned that it's really important to approach rural communities differently than when planning in urban or urbanizing communities. And this sort of shows what we've found as a little bit of the differences between working in urban and rural. And so in the interest of time, I'm not going to go on what's the same, but I think what's really important is rural is that they tend to have very little planning staff and very little resources for planning. And a lot of the people who work on it are volunteers, wear many hats, their resources are scarce, and they have a distaste for regulation. So where in urban areas, regulatory fixes are relatively easy, you may not think so, but relative to rural, and they have dedicated staff and diversified funding. In rural, you really have to build collaborative partnerships between public and private sectors to get things done. And so finally, sort of the major elements that we think have to go into a good plan for agriculture are protecting farmland, promoting conservation, and supporting agriculture. It certainly can have more, but I've tried to group the various types of policies, programs, and public investments which can result from a plan under these three elements. And so when you're looking to protect farmland, the policies include things like purchase of ag conservation easements or development rights, which I've mentioned along the way, ag zoning and other zoning that help keep land available for farming. It also includes approaches like transfer of development rights, which combine the two, and things like mitigation ordinances, voluntary ag districts or overlays, taxing farms as farms and not based on their potential highest and best use, and so on. And we have lots of resources available on our Farmland Information Center to help you if you want to do that. Promoting conservation includes things like supporting your local conservation district, who can help farmers adopt conservation practices and regenerative farming practices, do conservation planning and nutrient management, streamlining regulations between federal, state, and local authorities, including ag and local climate action plans, And finally, supporting ag is the most complex and includes things like addressing allowable and accessory uses, from farm labor housing to on-farm marketing and value-added processing. It could be hiring an ag economic development person, leasing land to farmers, or providing property tax relief and incentives for landowners to lease land to farmers, public procurement policies like farm to school, providing marketing and promotional support, investing in infrastructure like a food hub or cold storage, and reducing conflicts between farmers and their neighbors through things like local right to farm laws, setbacks, and buffers. And with that, I will wrap and go to questions.
Great, thank you very much, Julia, and thanks to Cris. We'll now transition into the Q&A. And again, thank you also for submitting all the questions today. We've gotten a good number of them, and we'll get through as many as we can till at least 2:30. We might go over a couple of minutes, given the volume that we've received so far. But please go ahead and continue to submit them. So I guess the first question I'm going to ask, I know we sent out something on the chat about this, but I think there was some question about the PVR term that you talked about at the beginning. Cris, maybe you could define that and maybe talk a little bit more about that, what that is.
Right, I can talk a little bit about it, but I would also welcome Julia, you jumping in. So what I understand, and again, I am not an author of either of these reports, but the productivity, versatility, and resiliency index that we created was intended to look beyond just soils, for thinking more sort of holistically about what the value of any type of land was, and particularly its value for growing over the long term food for direct human consumption. Because I guess thinking broadly about food security into the future, it's important that we think about this type of land and the best of the best that can continue to be very productive over a long period of time with the least environmental impacts on it. So the PVR values considered soils, soil limitations, climate, type of production, and whether the land is capable of producing commonly cultivated crops and pastured plants without deterioration over a long period of time. So the factors involved were soil productivity. We looked at land use and cover, and how often and how long has land been producing food for direct human consumption. There was a lot more that went into it in terms of different numbers of factors, and I would just suggest that people go to, there is a technical report for those who are interested on the Farmland Information Center when you go to the Farms Under Threat State of the States report that provides a lot more information about how that was done. But Julia, anything more to add on that front?
No, I think that's great. And I think sort of digging, there are multiple data layers that were used, but they were all national data layers. So, that kind of limits some of the local interpretation. But Cris is right. We were really looking at sort of not just looking, usually productivity is based on corn suitability index and is very sort of biased towards Midwestern farming conditions. And we really wanted to look at what was necessary for so-called specialty crops as well, and human food consumption, not just sort of livestock feed consumption.
Great, thanks, Julia. We'll just launch into other questions here. And the first one is from Carol Robeck, who asks, as a consultant planner, I often work with communities walking the tightrope between suburban and rural development. What advice would you give in approaching conversations with landowners of former ag land with strong interest in development of that land?
So former landowners, I guess it depends on how long ago they were in farming. I mean, I think this is a place where working with focus groups or small community gatherings is really good, so that it's not just you trying to convince an individual, but it's people kind of hearing what matters to their neighbors and to the community at large. Usually farmers are very influenced by other farmers. And so even if it's a former farmer, I think hearing from somebody who maybe is a young or beginning farmer who wants to get into agriculture and has a huge barrier to land access, hearing that, you know, what they might do could be of value to somebody else who sort of shares at least what maybe once was their vocational passion, could be really helpful in convincing them. I don't know, Cris, what do you think?
No, I think that's spot on.
Great, thank you. We'll just move on to the next question. This one's from Cindy Gray, who asks, does AFT collaborate with APA in a way that would be of greater help to practitioners? I feel this is an area where APA could really bolster its support to planners working for public agencies, especially in small urban and rural areas, where planners face a lot of opposition to things like county comprehensive plans and policies that preserve agriculture, even though that's their livelihood.
So, so yes, we have. One of the projects that I mentioned in my presentation was Growing Food Connections, and APA was a partner in that project. I have to admit that since COVID, we've gotten a little out of touch. So I think that's a great inspiration for us to kind of rekindle that relationship. I used to work really closely with David Rouse, but he retired a few years ago, and I think it's time for us to strengthen that. But yes, our Farmland Information Service has worked a lot with folks in the Planning Advisory Service. We've gone to APA conferences. We go most years, although again, since COVID, we've been a little bit more absent. So yeah, I think that's a great suggestion.
It is a great suggestion, and I just want to add that we launched the National Agricultural Land Network in 2020. Again, it was sort of in the midst of COVID, and it is one of my hopes and aspirations that we can do much more joint programming with APA, both nationally and with state chapters associations. So again, if folks have particular thoughts and ideas on how best to do that, we would welcome that, and please reach out to me with any suggestions. But it is our hope that, again, this network might be a way to integrate some of this thinking about agriculture and planning tools. So it's a really good suggestion, and any particular thoughts on how to further that connections would be great.
Thank you. Next question here is from Jane Matthews, who says, I love the website that you showed and can use it immediately. I work on the City of Fort Worth's new open space preservation program, and I'm writing a developer education sheet to try to introduce the need to rein in sprawl and keep open space undeveloped and contiguous. And I need to be brief and compelling. Do you have any resources, and have you ever seen that sort of outreach before directly to the subdivider and developer?
That's a really good question, and I don't know that we have anything in our resources that are directed at developers. Not that I'm aware of. Julia?
No, but it is a great idea. Yeah. You know, in planning processes, we do try to get them to the table as part of the stakeholder group and to engage with them. But in terms of developing resources specifically for them, no, I can't think of anything that we've really done in that space.
Okay, excellent. Next question, obviously there could be more discussion about that as well. So if anybody has any suggestions for you can maybe submit that in the questions tab, and we can share those as well. But next question here is from Kirby Date, who asks, your classification of better built implies that limiting the footprint of development is the best approach. But what are the best tools for this? More compact growth or direct preservation measures?
Do you want to take a stab at that, Julia, or you want me to?
I just say yes. yes, and yes, both. I really do think we need to use a combination of tools. I don't think there is, sort of a silver bullet. I really think that and this is what we learned a lot in the last Farms Under Threat report when we looked at what state policies have done, is that those states that have combined permanent protection with smart growth have been the most successful overall. So I think you really, if you can do both, you should do both. The problem is that there's some places that really rely on zoning and don't want to put any dollars towards investment and protecting their best land. And then there are other places like, the Northeast where people won't do ag zoning. So you're sort of stuck only with permanent protection through, easement programs and places where people are going to invest public dollars. But if you can do both, that is to me, the ideal scenario. Cris?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add to that is, there has been understandable resistance in some quarters to thinking about something short of permanent agricultural land protection. And I think we need to be open to shorter term approaches and approaches like ag districts and way that provide short term or additional incentives for farmers and ranchers to keep their land in production. So again, it's a little bit, it's to Julia's point that it's yes, but to think more broadly about a variety and combination of approaches that doesn't necessarily have to include or look entirely to permanent ag land protection.
Yeah, I agree. And also finding other ways to finance it. So whether that's through mitigation ordinances or transfer of development rights, that kind of thing, I think also comes into play.
Okay, thank you. Next question here is from Stephen Conchafter, who asks, this is a very important topic and a great tool. The issue of affordable housing is also pressing. Would you be able to model potential impacts to affordable housing using the 3 future scenarios? And are there examples of building better but also affordable? I could imagine that maybe there might be in European counterparts.
The modeling is so far from my area of expertise that I would not begin to know how to model on the affordable housing approach. And I wonder with there are folks in the audience who have ideas on that, because I think we'd be very interested. And I don't know, in terms of other approaches, we have been struggling, and as we've been thinking, particularly about farmland protection, understanding that affordable housing is as much an issue for the next generation of farmers and ranchers as it is for anybody, right? So at least from our more narrow perspective, and not thinking about affordable housing generally, but just in the agriculture sphere, we are beginning to think more about what are the ways to combine affordable housing and agricultural land protection, because that is a challenge. And we are finding and hearing more and more stories of farmers and ranchers who may be on protected land, but they don't have an opportunity to build a house, or a house is just too expensive to build in that particular location. So in thinking about affordable housing, as people are thinking about it generally, to realize that it is an issue for farmers and ranchers as much as it is for the general population.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Rich Brown, who says, in my small rural New Hampshire town with 1,700 residents and 33 people per square mile, we already have a lot of sprawl, large homes on large lots, especially farther out on our smaller roads. Can these lots ever be converted back to agricultural land, and does this ever happen?
You want to take that? You want me to take that?
You take that.
So yes, I think it depends on how large the lot is and what kind of agriculture. But certainly you can do a lot of fruit and vegetable production on small acreage, and people do, and people can earn a living doing that. So yes, I think it is possible to reclaim it if there are some acres. I think if it's on a 1/4 acre lot, you're pushing it. But if it's on a 5 acre lot or a 10 acre lot, certainly It's why zoning in New England can get so tricky, because a lot of our farms are small acreage farms, but doing high value kind of local food production. And they can do that on small acreages. So I think that there's always hope, but I also think when the value of that property is an estate, then it's very hard for a farmer to gain access to it, even if the land could be made available, because it's just outside of their reach. And I did think it was really interesting in the poll that high land values, came up as the big threat, because I actually agree with that right now. I think high land values are making it really hard for agriculture, as well as for everybody else in affordable housing and so on.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, with the loss of farmland, how concerned should we be with regard to food security in the future?
That depends on who you ask. If you ask commodity agriculture, they're not concerned, because they think technology is the fix. And if you ask people who are doing vertical agriculture in cities, they might think that that's going to be a fix. I actually think it's something we have to take really seriously. And the issue of developing our best farmland, it's the quality as well as the quantity that really, really matters if we care about food production in the future, and we care about not only feeding our communities and not only domestic food security, but the fact that climate change is going to have a really significant impact across the globe and on a lot of low wealth countries, and that there's going to be a real need for us to participate in the sort of in feeding people around the world. And I always say that with a little bit of caution, because I think we talk a lot about how right now we're feeding the world, but we're really feeding, our major export crops are corn, soybeans, and beef. And the corn and soybeans primarily are going for livestock feed. So yes, indirectly, that is ending up feeding people. But when you're looking at climate and climate implications, that may not be the most resilient way for us to be working. So I think there's a lot that we have to look at in that food security equation, but I do think that it's something we need to take very, very seriously. And I think globally people do much more than they do here in this country.
And I think I would just add, and it's just to underscore that a point that Julia made earlier, is that what we came out of through and after COVID is that really that food security needs to be looked at on a regional and local level, because we can't trust that even though nationally we might have food that locally and regionally we may not, and there are disruptions that can be either natural or man-made that make it important to have those regional and local food systems in place, so that that food security is not just global, not just national, but at a much smaller community level as well. And so thinking about agricultural land and the base and the ability to sustain a community at a more regional and local level is important as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's really should be part of a resiliency strategy, is to build in that redundancy. And that's partly having the ag land, but it's also having ag infrastructure.
Right.
So yes, I think it's really, from a community food security perspective, I think it's really, really important. And I think we did see that with COVID, right? I mean, we had eggs. Cris raises eggs, so I had eggs. But it came Easter, and a lot of supermarkets around the country didn't have eggs because of supply chain breakdowns. So yes, I think it really is, from a resiliency as well as sort of a local economy perspective, really important.
Thank you. Next question here is, I've heard discussions about how agriculture and solar can share land in a mutually beneficial way, such as solar panels providing shade for crops like tomatoes in hot climates. What are your thoughts on this?
American Farmland Trust has been working and is involved in a number of projects around agrivoltaics or dual use solar, which again is trying to, when I said that there are opportunities for a balance, I think the jury is still out on what kind of crops can be grown, crops and livestock can be grown in coordination with solar. There is some interesting research happening out there. And if folks want to go to the Farmland Information Center, there is, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of good materials, including a lot of research that is happening on agrivoltaics. And I think that as we go forward, you know, that as solar expands, it also seems like solar technology, like the opportunity to have vertical fencing that is solar based. So I think that moving forward, I'm hopeful, I think AFT is hopeful that there will be more and more opportunities to have solar and agriculture be compatible with each other.
Great, thank you. Are you guys okay if we go over a few minutes, because we still have many more questions? Maybe another 5-10 minutes. Okay, excellent. Next question here is from Peter Waganis, who says, here in the Midwest, we've lost a huge amount of agricultural farmland converted to corn ethanol production. Can you elaborate on the effects of that conversion on land prices and how that might contribute to the overall problem you've been talking about today?
I can take a crack at it. The land values issue is really complex, and I'm definitely not an expert in it. But it has been clear for a long time that you know, prices for ag land for corn ethanol have been going up, and they keep going up, and that then makes it hard for other kinds of agriculture to compete. So if, you know, if we want to start thinking about resiliency in our communities, we really do have to deal with this sort of issue of ag land values. What's going to happen with corn ethanol isn't really clear to me. You know, it's a really complicated issue. But I think even if ethanol comes out of the equation, you know, the majority of US ag land is used for corn production, and it's, you know, it's primarily for livestock feed, and then it's also for ethanol. It's basically not for human, like direct human use, except for maybe corn syrup and cornstarch and stuff like that. So I think it's a pretty tricky issue, but I do think it's one that we sort of need to consider, especially as we're thinking about ways to transform agriculture for resiliency.
Great, thank you. Next question here is from Paul Owens, who asks, many conservation advocates in Florida, where I live, consider agriculture to be a major culprit in water quality problems through nutrient loading from fertilizer runoff. How can we maintain agriculture and still improve our water quality?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think that's not limited to Florida, right? There are many parts of the country where agriculture is a contributor. The good news is that we have the tools to address it, right? There are, and I think we're very lucky right now that we're at a point in time that because of the new federal Inflation Reduction Act that has brought an additional $20 billion in investments in agriculture conservation programs through USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service and the conservation title of the programs through the conservation title of the Farm Bill, that these are the types of practices, voluntary practices for which there is cost share available from the federal government. And these are, we know, can be helpful in reducing water quality challenges and can be useful in sequestering carbon. So meeting both water quality objectives as well as climate objectives. And so the good news is that there is a lot of additional federal incentives out there for producers and landowners to be adopting additional conservation practices. So I think that there are also state investments, and in many places there's sort of investment even at the county level. So I guess that I would say that where we still need work is that we need the boots on the ground of the people who can help to educate and do the outreach around those kinds of programs. And particularly with the federal funding, there's often a need for matching funds. So can states and counties provide some of that additional support so it's not coming on the backs of landowners and producers? But I think the big challenge at the moment is there enough funding, and is there enough delivery of those of the folks who can provide the technical assistance to the producers and landowners, who I think a lot of times are very interested in conservation, right? If it can work from a financial perspective, and usually it does, because it's improving productivity over the long haul. So typically what is going to be good for water quality is also going to be good for the bottom line for a producer. So I guess that would be my thoughts, but Julia might have others.
I think that's a great and comprehensive answer.
Great, thank you. We'll just ask you a couple more. Next one's from Brenda Root, who asks, I work for a regional planning commission. Is there a way to combine all the counties we serve into a combined report to download?
That's an excellent question. So here is my suggestion would be to use that request data tab. You can either get to it in the website, or I think you can go straight to the farms under threat and request the data for the whatever the counties you have. The challenge, I think, is that a bunch of the spatial data comes, there's no way on the website that we just showed you to combine all of the data layers. So you sort of have to build your own GIS database that is going to include the PVR values, the past conversion, and the projected conversion. But all of those, all of that spatial data is available by county. So if you have the ability to do it sort of in-house, you certainly could, just by requesting those layers. If it's not something you can do in-house, I know that we are working with counties or regions who might be interested in getting sort of more customized farms under threat data together. So please feel free to reach out if you don't think that what you see is going to be helpful and you would like some additional sort of help thinking through what could be useful and how AFT could help.
Okay, thank you. I think we have another question here about the mapping from Jamie Reppert, who asked, I noticed a large area in Southern California in the under threat mapping, but I'm concerned that lack of access to water shifts criteria from best soils to best soil and water resources. Is there any way to adjust for water resources when considering development pressure and ag resiliency?
I'll leave the bigger global question to Julia, because I think she's been thinking more about that. I will say that we recognize that that was a significant challenge in the Farms Under Threat 2040, and being able to look at water scarcity and availability into the future. I think we are thinking about how we can do more of that modeling. I will say that I know that California has done some prioritization work, I think in the San Joaquin, and so there might be a tool that would be available in parts of California. So it might be worth, please feel free to reach out and I can connect you with our California office about that. And I don't know, Julia, what else you might have to add to that.
Only that it's a limitation that we're really aware of, maybe even a little frustrated by. Obviously time and money come into play in any kind of activity like this. But I would say that our California office, but even, working in Colorado and other places that have been really affected by drought, really want to to sort of add in that water dynamic and not just do it sort of because of soil qualities, but also really looking at the availability of water, period. So I really hope that nationally we'll take this on more, but Cris is right, our California office is dealing with it sort of on the ground in California and has some tools available that could help.
Excellent. I guess we'll have one more question here, given where we are with time. And it's from Mel Litter, who asks, what do you see as the role agroforestry plays in small farm sustainability, as well as a bridge from small farms to urban indoor and emerging technology practices as sustainability models?
I'll just offer a personal opinion. It's not something that AFT has worked on significantly that I'm aware of. I think it is very valuable, and I know that through New England that thinking about agroforestry, that there are a lot of folks working on integrating forestry and various products that can be grown under forest cover, as well as livestock under forest cover. So I think it's a terrific idea, but I would just say that I don't know that AFT has much expertise in the area of agroforestry.
Well, this is one of those webinars where we could easily go another half an hour, 45 minutes with all the questions, but we're already 10 minutes over. So I think we'll stop here. You see that everybody in the audience can see your contact information, and we will share all the questions and comments with Julie and Cris afterward, and Beth as well. So we did want to follow or finish up with some closing thoughts here today, and I think what we'll do is start with Cris.
Great. Well, I just want to say thank you, and thank you for everybody for hanging in there with us, and thank you, Michael, for this excellent opportunity, and to John, we appreciate it. And I'll close with a shameless plug for the National Agricultural Land Network. As I like to say, a network is only as good as its members, and we are really trying to grow a national community of folks who are working to save farmland and ranchland. And when I save it, I don't mean just permanent protection. I mean retaining that base of land that we all know is so necessary and important for both the economy and the environment and communities. So if you have any interest, please look us up. Please be in touch if you have any questions. It's a free network. And whoever made the suggestion about APA, we will continue to explore opportunities to grow our programming around planning and agriculture, because we know that it's a very important topic. So appreciate the time today.
Thanks, Cris. That's a hard act to follow. I just would say that thank you all for participating. We never know who's going to come to these things, and we were very pleased to see the kind of diversity of folks. And I was really excited by the kinds of questions that you asked. I always like questions that I can't answer, that I have to think about more. So that was really helpful. It's exciting to think that there is this community of people who maybe aren't really directly in our space, but who are close to our space, who we can work with going forward, and who maybe, going back to that first poll where 47% of you weren't involved with agriculture, maybe we'll start to see why it's so important to include agriculture in smart growth strategies and in your planning and local policy activities. So with that, thank you so much for participating. Michael and John, thank you so much for inviting us or allowing us. Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak to y'all.
And thanks to you both also, Julia and Cris. So with that, we're going to conclude our webinar today, Farms Under Threat 2040, Choosing an Abundant Future. I'd like to offer a giant thank you to Cris Coffin and Julia Freedgood for a great presentation, for Brett Frazier, who was working behind the scenes with us today, To everyone who attended and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru who helps to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email if you need the certificate to claim other continuing education credits. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. And finally, keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars, including the first of our Walktober Walk-in-Hour programs next Thursday morning, National Perspectives on Walking and Pedestrian Safety, as well as other programs throughout October on Thursdays. And then we also have a program on the park maker and the form giver, how Frederick Law Olmsted and Henry Hobson Richardson reinvented America's public spaces, which will be held on Tuesday, October 11th. So with that, we wish you all a great day.